I want to welcome you back to the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship Symposium on the Common Good. As the interim director of the ICC, I would like to introduce a member of our advisory board who will moderate our closing panel with Dr. Nicholas Cafardi, Dr. Kristin Heyer, and Bishop Robert McElroy. Dr. Bernard Brady has reflected on the theme of this symposium since his graduate studies at the University of Chicago, where he wrote a dissertation entitled Rights, the Common Good, and Roman Catholic Social Thought. Among his 5 books, I would like to highlight 2 that enter into direct conversation with the lectures that we have heard. The Moral Bond of Community, Justice and Discourse in Christian Morality, published by Georgetown University Press, and Essential Catholic Social Thought, published by Orbis. He has also co-edited Religion and Public Life, The Legacy of Monsignor John A. Ryan. Among the awards that he has received are the John Ireland Presidential Award, the Outstanding Faculty and Service Learning Award, and Professor of the Year. He has served as chair of the Theology Department at the University of St. Thomas since 2006. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bernard Brady to moderate this panel.
I have to say that these past 2 days have been the best hours I've spent in a long time. Thank you very much for your contributions. 2 objectives for our last session. Well, one objective really is to get the 3 of you talking to each other and maybe see if we can get them to disagree about some things. But also to have them talking to each other roll out to the group here and have some larger conversations. I want to do this, or start this off by doing 2 things. First, I want to give a very short and perhaps unfair summary of what you've talked about in the past day and so. And then I want to go on a fishing expedition, and I have 6 ideas, and I'm going to invite any one of you to take a bite at any one of these, and we'll see where we go from there. Professor Heyer's described for us the dominant culture today around immigration, based on fear of security, economic position, and fundamental national identity. And she offered to us a rich alternative process for thinking about a counter-narrative based on the Christian and Catholic traditions. Her argument was itself wrapped up in powerful narratives, and they have a very persuasive power. I'm going to remember for a long time that student that you ended what the student said that you ended your presentation with. It reminded me of my family, my father's grandparents from Ireland, my mother from Ireland, and I remember going to Ireland for the first time between my freshman and sophomore years of high school, and my mother's from the far west of Ireland in Mayo, realizing, oh yeah, I can see why she immigrated, given the poverty of the place, which helps me somewhat get in touch with why people migrate, somewhat on a level. You added some familiar biblical narratives and gave us helpful nuances in understanding them. Of course, you went deep into the tradition of Catholic social teaching over the past 125 years and pulled out some common themes and messages on that. You invited us to think of family values, which is pitched in a certain way in the dominant American narrative. You invited us to think about that differently and look at the systems we have that routinely separate families, split families, leaving many women and children vulnerable. You appealed both to matters of the heart and the mind with us, I think, and you moved us to do something, and we should be doing something right now. Bishop McElroy invited us to recall John Courtney Murray's idea of a growing end of the argument. So I had to find that quote. Bear with me for a moment. This is from the introduction of Murray's famous book, We Hold These Truths, published in 1960. And I can hear Murray's voice in your talk, Bishop, when he says, the whole premise of the public argument if it is to be civilized and civilizing, is that the consensus is real, that among the people, everything is not in doubt, but there's a certain core of agreement, accord, concurrence, acquiescence. We hold certain truths, therefore we can argue about them. And I'm struck by your image of the 75% in that left brain, right brain comment you made last night. Murray mentions Leo the 13th, stressing a heritage of essential truth, a tradition of rational belief that sustains the structure of the city and furnishes the substance of civil life. It was to this patrimony that the Declaration of Independence referred. These are the truths we hold. Murray goes on to say in later chapters he will make an effort to state the concerns of the contents of public consensus. Briefly, its principles and doctrines are those of Western constitutionalism, classic and Christian. This is our essential patrimony, laboriously wrought out by centuries of thought, further redefined and developed in our own land to fit the needs of the new American experiment in government. In addition, as will appear later, the consensus has a growing end, as American society itself has a growing end. My point at this moment, however, is that there are two reasons why this consensus furnishes the basic theme of public argument, whereby American society hopes to achieve and maintain the mark of civility. One, we hold these truths because they are our patrimony, and secondly, we hold these truths because they are true. As a heritage and a public philosophy, the American consensus needs to be constantly argued. In this spirit, you addressed so well and so comprehensively problems in American political discourse, so much so that a member of the audience thought you should run for president. You invited 3 conversions in American political discourse, from divisiveness to solidarity, from bisecting the good to the common good, and the movement of U.S. domination in the world to a sense of a global common good. As with Murray, you see the intimate connection of the American tradition and its notion of social goods with Roman Catholic social thought and its notion of social goods. In very strong and fairly powerful comments you made descriptions of the moral limits of our two parties. You reminded us of the difference between talking and dialogue, and you walked us carefully through the issues of poverty, war, and the environment, reminding us that these are key moral as well as political issues. You asked us to see the human face. I wrote that down 3 times last night in your talk, asking us to see the human face, to see others as brothers and sisters, calling on Pope Francis's call for the inclusion of poor and all members in society. And you left us with an interesting phrase that I think this whole conference is about, developing a Catholic political imagination. A Catholic political imagination. 2 adjectives, and imagination to describe the thinking process, the conscience, as it were, of the Church and individual Catholics. Which leads us nicely into our address this morning. I was struck by the powerful call for individuals to make moral choice and to reflect on their own conscience. Your principles of political activity, well, we might want to nuance them once or twice. We probably add 1 or 2, but are strong and workable and reflect prudence in the Thomistic sense and not simply the pragmatic sense. And your call for kind of a new Catholic moment, a universalist, not exclusive, not mindless philosophy that adds real strength and power to American political discourse. A theme uniting all of you is Catholics are not called to run away, quote from the Polis. And I immediately thought of Jesus going to the mountain and Jesus going by the lake and coming back down. 6 quick ideas for fishing, and this has to do with the role of individuals and the role of the church and recommendations or thoughts you might have. The first, when Aquinas and others in the Catholic tradition have talked about the common good, they've talked about two sets or two kinds of goods. Simply put, moral goods, those kinds of things that hold communities and relationships together, and physical goods, those goods that are common to humanity. Both sets of goods are shared and communicable. We tend to focus on the physical goods, I think, in our discussions of the common good, and not the moral bond, if you will, or the moral goods that hold us together as a people. Second idea, the cultural wars affect everybody, including Catholics. We breathe them in. The air is thicker and stronger than the air of Catholic teaching. I spent last January in Rome. I don't mean to be bragging right now, but I took our Theology 101 to Rome in January. And I was kind of surprised a couple times going to different English-speaking churches and being in liturgies that seemed, I would say, traditional, and got a sense of, by American standards, kind of a conservative way of worshiping and praying, and to hear on several occasions what I thought to be very, forgive the word, liberal homilies. And I quickly realized that the notion of liberal and conservative in America may be very different from Catholics elsewhere in the world. And I get that, of course, from Pope Francis as well. So it's the question of helping us and Catholics and the church and factions within the church being able to be critical participants in culture and to take steps away from the cultural wars. Third, the notion of the common good throughout the tradition lays an important role in the hands of the state. For Thomas Aquinas, the king had important roles. When you read the Compendium, or you read Pacem in Terris, or Rerum Novarum, each of those documents talk about what governments should do, what they should not do. Multiple times the role of governments are addressed. We all in the Catholic tradition know that the government has a positive but limited role in the common good. And this was referred to earlier, Stephen's point about the general sense of the government as not being good today, so that tension about the role of government in enabling the common good. When I was in a fourth point, when I was in Rome, I also realized, talking to people, that when I vote in the United States, I'm voting for people around the world, and they are very interested in things political in America. My sense of responsibility as a voter was heightened to realize the impact of American policy on places around the world. Number 5, maybe a personal thing here. I think we confuse candidates with messiahs too often. In other words, we have to put everything we have in a candidate and expect them to be perfect, not simply a good candidate or a better candidate, but the perfect candidate. What would happen in political discourse if we realized our politicians were human? And shouldn't we be more kind of practical in our voting on that? And the final comment is about the common good as a historical principle in relationship to contemporary uses. As was noted last night, the common good as an idea comes from Greek and Roman philosophy. Augustine used it. Thomas Aquinas used it and wrote much about it. Didn't write much substantively about it, but he wrote about it. And my guess is that in those cultures, there was a lot of commonality compared to our pluralistic community. They knew each other. They knew each other's religion. They knew each other's habits. They knew each other's culture. They shared the same culture, language. In a pluralistic society, we don't know others who make up the commons with us. We don't know, speaking generally, the immigrant or the Muslim or the pregnant woman living in poverty who doesn't know the way out. And it seems to me, in order to develop a more contemporary notion of the common good to match this, is that people need to know, in order to have pity or sympathy or compassion or solidarity, people in some way need to experience or be with the others. So those are my fishing casts here off 6 different sides of my boat, and I invite any of you to comment on any one of these and open up as we go along.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brady, for that overview of a rich, packed day and a half together. Pardon me. Maybe I will give some first thoughts based on the line that you've cast out, and then we can return to some of them. I find these really quite helpful reflections, and some of them are interrelated. Maybe I could just pick up on 2 or 3. Pardon me. Your first point about this distinction between moral goods and physical goods, and your last point about being able to assume a shared common experience in the historical antecedents of the common good, I think are particularly productive and challenging for this immigration question that I started with yesterday. I think our policy focuses more on meeting physical needs, and yet we saw, or I tried to convey yesterday, how big of an obstacle not having a sense of shared identity that's not over and against an outsider can truly be. And I think it's an argument both for, I forget your colleague who is leading the faculty reading group's name here. Can you tell me your name? She's looking away. Marta's point yesterday about incarnational solidarity practices, right? We need to be able to border cross these ideological divides and these physical divides, experiential divides, or go to El Paso. This gentleman from Chicago, now Minnesota, has been talking to me about. But also I think it's an invitation to Bishop McElroy's line from Murray about the growing ends of the argument, because I think the Catholic tradition has very rich resources for a counter-narrative, but it too is constantly in need of refinement, right? Because if we look at the Aristotelian polis, it sounds really great and enviable as long as you weren't a slave or a woman, right? So I think it also entails our asking kind of who counts. Bishop McElroy mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement last night, and kind of where are places that the Catholic tradition can both offer a counter-narrative. Dr. Cafardi's point that politics need not be a dirty word. I think we could do a lot better on talking about government as social and pursuing the common good, not government as enemy. Even candidates for political office talk about people inside the Beltway, even though that's what they're running to take over. An outsider somehow becomes a benefit. I think we can both put the riches of that conversation and of our tradition into conversation with insights from outsiders at this growing end of the tradition, as Murray and Bishop McElroy put it, to help build on that commonality. I was saying at the break, rereading Murray sometimes makes me nostalgic. It's so helpful, kind of clarify the real pluralism so we can have people locked together in argument. That is very far from the level of rhetoric we see this campaign season, or as we were saying, maybe on our airwaves and in our own churches and Thanksgiving dinner tables. And yet it did rely on, if not homogeneity that we don't have today, some shared truths, as you put it. So I think, how can we offer that boldly and candidly, as Pope Francis has said, rather than fearfully, but also how can we listen? How can we really take seriously this invitation to encounter?
Thanks, Kristin. I too want to respond to some of the questions that you raised, Doctor, and particularly the one on the culture wars. I think if you contrast the culture wars with the type of dialogue Murray's talking about, you see the two polarities. You see American politics at its best and at its worst. And my fear on the culture wars is it's one that's the Catholic communities and the hierarchy is particularly susceptible to getting sucked into, because on these pertaining to these issues of sexuality particularly. And it is in the main going to be very destructive if we continue to let that be a major part of the argumentation over politics, I think, on an ongoing basis. Now, I certainly want to separate out the issue of abortion from issues of sexuality, but still, the culture wars, I think, represent where we don't want to go and a dynamic that we want to get out of. But just within the section you read from Murray believed and really the founders believed that we would only succeed if we could have some level of common dialogue where we do engage with each other, not always agreeing, but engaging with each other in dialogue. So disagreement requires a certain level of commonality, and that as we as a people discuss how to do that. And it went to a point you brought up earlier on the morality of voting, which I agree with you on the morality of voting. And now I disagree a little bit, Mike, with the point you brought up, in that I think voting is a moral act. That doesn't mean the bishops should be saying who you vote for, even on issues of referendums. I mean, from time to time, they should teach on it. And the question was raised, should somebody have to go to confession because they voted for one thing or another? No, that isn't good Catholic moral theology in any sense, because I presume they're doing it out of conscience. I wrote an article in 2008 on called the moral act of voting, and I was afraid to publish it. I never did. Yeah, because I thought it would cause so much. Well, I had written one on Eucharistic sanctions that caused a stir. So I thought after that one, but I really liked it. I still have it. I've never published it. But my argument was basically that the moral act of voting is it is a moral act, but that the moral act for a voter is to advance the common good by voting for that candidate that he or she, the voter, thinks has the best chance of advancing the common good in the particular job you're voting for them for. So for most positions, it doesn't matter so much what their issue is on certain paramount issues. You're voting for them to be certain positions. Who will do the best job in advancing the common good in that position? And thus, I think that is a moral choice. Kathleen Caveney has an initial set of it, but I've never seen a discussion theologically. I'd love to see a conference on the moral act of voting, because to me it's a very interesting proposition, and I've never seen anything really done in depth on it. So, but I think it is a moral act. But it means that when you go in the voting booth, you're not voting for a platform. You're not voting for a set of positions the candidate might hold. You're voting for who do you think is best going to advance the common good, given their character, given their temperament, given their capabilities, given the position they're running for, and that's the moral act of voting, I think.
If you wanted to publish that under a pseudonym, I have a name I could give you.
Yes, I wish you would. I really enjoyed your article on Canon 916 and application to politicians. I'm the only non-trained theologian up here. To get my canon law degree, I had to have 1 year of theology, but it was not a degree granting year. They just wanted to make sure I had the vocabulary. And in canon, lawyers and theologians almost never agree. There's a statue in the Boboli Gardens in Florence. It's a really, really fat Roman god riding on top of a turtle. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a reasonably famous image. And the canon lawyers say it's a statue of a theologian coming to a conclusion. And the theologians say no, it's a statue of a canon lawyer fleeing temptation. So my training is not heavily theological. So I want to talk about something else that you mentioned, your experiences of the church in Italy as opposed to the American church, and I think this is a good. It always indicates to me how too embroiled our church has become and the American church has become in what you call the culture wars. You know, when I'm in my Italian home, we belong to the parish of San Flaviano, and Saint Flavian is buried under the altar. He's a Roman martyr of the 3rd century, and I find it so strange. First of all, you walk into church, and there are no flags on the altar. There's no Italian flag. There's no papal flag. Think about that. All of our churches, we have flags on the altar. Typically, there's an American flag. There's a papal flag. And whenever we get to the prayer of the faithful, I've not been to one mass in Italy where in the prayer of the faithful we either prayed for our armed forces or we prayed to fight the great sin of abortion. They never mentioned either one. And this is the same Catholic Church. And when the sermons come up, the sermons are invariably sermons about helping the poor. Italy right now, as you know, has many migrants that are passing through, and each parish has adopted some. I mean, our parish has adopted a few families of migrants, and then typically that's what the sermon is about. I mean, it's really basic gospel Christianity. I told the story during the intermission. My father, who I mentioned in my talk, for his anniversary mass, we always have it in our home parish. And one year, it was the mass was during the time when we were debating the Affordable Care Act. And there was a very young priest. He was really wet behind the ears. And of course, the mass is for Nicholas Cafardi Sr. I'm a junior. I don't use it, and so he knew. And I mean, my article in America had just appeared saying that the bishops were wrong to oppose the Affordable Care Act. The entire sermon was about the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't about the gospel, and he was looking right at me. I mean, we've drifted from, you know, that's one reason why you go into an Italian church, you see the drift. I mean, we've allowed our church to become way too embroiled in the culture wars. And it troubles me because I think it does great damage to our church. I think it's one reason why our pews are emptying out. I mean, the culture wars just aren't as attractive as the gospel. So that's my non-theological response to your insights. I think you got it exactly right. It's a slightly different church.
I would just say one thing on the Affordable Care Act. I think that was an example where the common good was not served by the bishop's vote, because what happened on that was they were looking for a purist position to come out of legislation, which doesn't happen. And so even though the risks of abortion flowing out from the Affordable Care Act were minimal and then increasingly minimized, the whole tradition of Catholic health care support was overturned because it wasn't 100% pure. And I have to say, we have an irony in California in that California now has enacted, it's actually a regulation, so that all medical insurance, this true medical insurance, we are now self-insured, all medical insurance policies in California have to include abortion of all kinds, including gender selection abortion. You cannot buy it. The only way you can buy true medical insurance in California that doesn't cover abortion is if you buy the Affordable Care Act. There's one of the provisions that allows you to do that in California, one set of policies which doesn't happen, which is here, you know, here's the opposite of what they've done. So.
Just to build on that example, I think I appreciated your bringing up conscience at the end of your talk this morning, because I think these two approaches to the political life or the political good, beyond being mired in the culture wars, assume pretty different images of conscience. And certainly there's been a tension between a more ecclesialist and personalist notion of conscience in the Catholic tradition. But I think I'm heartened by the quote that you offered from yesterday's document, this formation rather than replacement. I think there's another line about not being a perfect recipe, or your caveat here about a purist approach, particularly when we're talking politics. Because I think a focus on the common good can reorient the Catholic voter away from maybe a preoccupation with avoiding dirty hands or too proximate a cooperation with evil, toward pursuing the good, pursuing growth. And I think that's really fertile in a lot of the ways you all mapped out, even internationally and domestically, in terms of how can we best, realistically, capture the good. And in the Catholic tradition, that's always tied to a particular attention to the most vulnerable, right? Not a utilitarian calculus. But I think the operative notion of conscience, getting away from simply avoiding evil or even superego, something more impoverished, and toward an active discernment and pursuit of the good, would be another step in the right direction for political witness.
If I could just, that reminds me, there was Murray has a line, when he was in a debate with Reinhold Niebuhr, I mean, it was a debate in journals, and in terms of international relations, and Niebuhr was taking the line, we can't have dirty hands, and Murray said, well, he's taking the Kantian position, where you can't have dirty hands, and the reason Kant has no dirty hands is he has no hands. Nothing gets done. You can't do the good if you don't get your hands dirty. And I'm reminded in the encyclical, or the apostolic exhortation yesterday, in the pivotal section of it, which to me was very beautiful, on that very difficult question of the divorce and remarriage issue. What the Pope says is, he says, I understand those who want more clarity in the life of the church. That is what the basic position as I read it is. The Pope's saying that the old normative presumption that if someone is in a second marriage without benefit of annulment, they cannot receive communion, as a presumption, as a presumptive rule, does not sufficiently express the room for the mercy of God. Thus, he's saying we need to have a more individualized look at the individual's conscience before God. Where do they stand? Where is God calling them to? And he says in this quote, I know that there are those who want more clarity in the life of the church. He said, but at the same time, if we truly are going to accompany, if the church is going to be a mother that truly accompanies men and women on their journey through the difficulty of divorce and remarriage, then sometimes as a mother she has to get her skirt and shoes muddied in order to be truly accompanying them. And I think that's the same thing you're saying. So.
Well, I certainly agree that in politics you get your, you don't just get your shoes muddy, you get everything muddy, because it's a system of compromises which really doesn't allow too much purity of conscience. And when we look for it, we end up as I think the bishops were in the Affordable Care Act, we end up paralyzed. I mean, I think at the end the bishops in that debate literally were paralyzed. They didn't know in which direction to go. But I strongly believe that, our church has always taught the primacy of the conscience. I mean, even Aquinas says, right, that if your conscience acts, and it's even if it's not been properly formed, you have to follow your conscience. And to give the bishops credit, that's faithful citizenship says pretty much that you need to inform your conscience. And once you inform your conscience, whatever decision you make is in fact the right decision for you. And I quoted the Pope. It's not the church's job to replace consciences. It's the church's job to form consciences. There was a section in the documents of the Vatican Council. I think it's in Dignitatis Humanae, where or it may be Gaudium et Spes. I'm not sure, but the point is the same. The bishops had a schema in front of them in which they talked about conscience. And the original schema said that we were to form conscience in accordance with the teachings of the church. In other words, the teachings of the church were the final formation of conscience. They didn't adopt that schema. They adopted this statement which says we must take into account the teachings of the church in forming our conscience. It's a major difference there. That's a major difference. What they're basically saying is, yes, understanding what the church teaches is a way you form your conscience, but in fact, in the final analysis, that does not necessarily bind your conscience. I mean, I think that's a phenomenal insight of the council. And I've used that more than once in making talks like these.
I just would point in a tandem with that, in the council's stress on the role of the laity. That is, in political life, the bishops are called to have virtually no role. No, seriously. I mean, that is, we as bishops are called to have a role in helping teach and form consciences. That's it. We're not supposed to be political actors. And that's, I can tell you among bishops, there's a great discussion about what does that mean, and how do you do that? And the great problem we have, I'll tell you, is people come to us and want to suck us into more and more active involvement. Now, for example, most of us, when we get sucked in, it's on issues of, as was talked about before, initiative. In California, we have initiatives and referenda all over the place. So there are a lot of those types of issues. But they want us to get involved early on, endorsing it and having it come in churches and signatures. And where we've come to is just we don't want to be, it's contrary to our role to be involved in that, on anything. Because when you say yes to one, then you got to everybody else. But our role is very minimal as political actors in terms of the church documents. It's the laity that all we do is supposed to teach principles and some applications, yes, that's true. But then it's up to the laity who are called to bring that into the public square in ways we're not called to bring it into the public square and act on it. And that's the legitimate call, I think.
Yeah. Mike?
It's a political act, and I'd be happy to debate that. But in discussion with Father Larry Snyder at the break, he pointed out, I said that the last time I was interested in what bishops thought about, frankly, much of anything, were the pastoral letters of the 1980s, because I thought that was an appropriate model. And particularly in the case of the one on nuclear weapons, the challenge of peace, where you were dealing with a military ordinance whose explicit purpose was the mass destruction of millions of non-combatants. They walked right up to the edge of saying that this is forbidden, and people who are in military service ready to do this need to resign there. They didn't do that. They left open a space, but they got really close. Both that and the letter on the economy, which was in some ways less happy, because the issues weren't quite as black and white, I think. They were models of synodality. And was it said last night, or I can't I'm already forgetting. This is an Episcopal practice that seems to have gone into abeyance. Why can we anticipate its return? Were it to happen, where I thought that they were addressing issues that were genuinely inclusive of what is realistically possible in American life. And I don't think that the criminalization of first trimester abortions is one of them. I'd be willing to take them more seriously, but if it happens before I go to the grave, I'll be very pleasantly surprised. Can you give me a more optimistic prognosis?
You want me to try that? Okay. I'd say a couple of things. One is I think those years of the War and Peace Pastoral and the Economic Pastoral were high water marks, okay? And to me, one of the interesting things was, two pieces of background. I was Archbishop Quinn's secretary. He was very active in it at the time when those documents were going on. At that time, 4 of the 5 chiefs and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were Catholic. And they took that stuff very seriously, the ethical stuff. Military people, in my experience, take the ethical stuff very seriously. They had a wonderful correspondence with Archbishop Quinn, back and forth over wrestling. They were wrestling with their consciences as Catholics. You know, these are the heads of 4 of the military branches. So it was a wonderful interchange, precisely in what it was meant to be. That is, with the laity, how do we struggle with this? How do we make sense of it, given what we're doing? I would say, if you're asking, no, we have not had a high water mark. A low water mark was during the recession when we tried to pass a pastoral letter on poverty, and it turned out very tepid, and you had all the liberals vote no on a document on poverty, and all the conservatives vote yes, and it failed because we couldn't come up with the document on poverty even in the recession that we agreed with. So that was a low water mark. Well, if you look at the documents on immigration, though, I'd say that's a different thing. There's a widespread consensus among the bishops on the importance of immigration. And there is a use there in some of those documents of narrative in an important way. And that is an issue where I think the Bishops' Conference do have a prophetic stand in our society now, and use that effectively. So that is some note of hope, where I think that is ongoing. We're not successful, but on the other hand, it's a major social institution which is pressing people's consciences still to move. And there is absolute unanimity of the bishops on the importance and the moral substance of that question.
It would be nice to have more doing what Archbishop Tobin in Indianapolis did, of hosting a Syrian family. Has he had to the dyspepsia of the governor of Indiana? Has he had any imitators?
I don't know on that particular one. I saw that and I thought, you know, sometimes you see this and you think, oh, that's really good. I should do that. But then I thought, I'm not sure I want to live with another family in my house, you know. So in all fairness, so I'm not sure if they're imitators. That was done for a particularly important reason. At the same time, on this question of immigration and on the refugee issue, there's been a very, very strong pushback toward the government on all levels from the conference on these issues. It's a neuralgic issue where I'd say there's a prophetic voice in our society that is probably the main prophetic voice on this issue.
I seem to have left I brought a page of the imitators, but they were all Protestant congregations that I could find. I liked, back to the conscience note, I liked the statement from Tobin that said to Pence, I have taken your concerns very seriously, and I'm still going to disagree with you and bring this family into my home. So I think that sense of modeling that, because it seems to me your question about the 80s is also one of process, not one of content. So kind of consultation process, how could we see that again in our local bishops' conferences with the wider laity, experts in economics and other fields, but also how can we push back and show a prophetic witness even when there's tensions between moral teaching or church and state in the case of Indiana.
Where is it? Up here? Okay.
Thanks very much. I've come here this weekend to try to get a better understanding and to hear from the three of you about the nature of the political common good. And I thank you three for being here and giving such interesting talks about that subject and related subjects. To me, it seems that we can say the political common good is something, when we take the idea of politics seriously, that's rooted in relationships, and it's rooted in particular communities of peoples, particular societies, as Bishop McElroy said last night. Now, the Affordable Care Act has come up just a handful of times already here as we've been talking. I've been interested in the contraceptive mandate, which has been controversial. I don't think we need to get into proving that point. But what I know about the legislative history of how that came about is that it wasn't about paying for and licensing good times, but rather it was about the longitudinal data, which said that this is an inexpensive way to prevent diseases that are expensive and cause suffering. And so it raises a question, can this be a part of the common good? Now, we get into some trouble when we think about the common good having a substantive or an authentic content. And that's where I oftentimes think that I want to disagree a little bit with John Courtney Murray, who I always feel was a little too cheerful about the relationship between the classical tradition of the natural law and the American constitutional tradition. I've wondered many times whether somebody as surprising as Hannah Arendt might have gotten it a little bit more right with what was just an aside in Between Past and Future, where she described what she felt like were the two most Roman institutions left in the world. The one is the obvious one, the Roman Catholic Church. The other is the United States, which has, she says, a Roman reverence for its moment of founding, but which is also a sense of itself as a society with a tradition oriented toward its past and in dialogue. And there in Republican Rome, the common good was what the Senate and the people of Rome were willing to say the common good was. So what I'm trying to do is trying to understand it. I'd invite anybody who would want to help me understand this better to think about whether the political common good needs to have a particular content, or whether, in a way, actually Bishop McElroy said a moment ago, where he talked about not wanting the 100% solution, the idea that we have to get our hands dirty, and what the people will assent to, almost in a Thomistic way too, what the people will assent to might be the best political common good we can find.
He said he mentioned you. It is another good question. But I agree. No, I think the common good is not an abstraction. Well, I mean, it is an abstraction, it's a concept. But I mean, it is a concrete reality. But it's what's attainable, what's realizable. It's in the context of particular communities. Even that definition, that's in the Vatican Council, what best propels and advances human flourishing at all levels of individuals and of groups in society. And so it's not a fully formed thing, it's not a specifically concrete thing, but it is that movement in society which moves toward those ends. And so that's why in discussing both the moral component of it and then the substance in terms of the collective goods questions, they're both at issue. But to me, in a sense, the moral component of solidarity is the prerequisite, needs to be there. Now, I agree with you, Murray had an optimistic, as so many people in the 50s and 60s did, an optimistic notion of the American consensus that kind of went down the tubes in the 60s. And Kristin, you were right that it wasn't totally inclusive, to put it mildly, of if you were African American or Native American or a woman, but given all that, what is to me most disturbing is that we don't have now this sense of solidarity to move toward that, and I think the compendium on social teaching really has that beautiful phrase that we should have a greater sense that we are all debtors of the society of which we are a part. That to me is that we have that at moments in our history. You know, when you think back to when are moments where we've had great solidarity, you know, 9/11, for example, moments like that. But that we should have that kind of a sense that we're debtors of the society of which we're a part. And that's an underlying part of our political discussion. And I think that's what's most alarming to me rather than a particular public policy prescription.
Just to add to that, I think Murray's vulnerable to those critiques. The debate with Murray, with Niebuhr is helpful in that regard, healthy sense of sin. But I do think Murray might agree with you, because in his other writings, like on the contraception question of his day, he really thought not everything that is moral should be legislated, and I think would be calling for a more persuasive approach, right, rather than criminalization or legislative approach in all cases. That's where I appreciate the attention to the humanity of politicians that Dr. Brady brought up, not expecting them to be messiahs. I think the immigrant rights community really saw the election of Barack Obama as this messianic moment, and have had to kind of reckon with his mixed record. I know that there have been a lot of efforts, but he's also deported more than all of his predecessors combined, for instance. Or the attention, as Dr. Cafardi was pulling out, to the practical ways in which people use rhetoric for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's sincere and genuine, but sometimes it's strategic, right? There was an interesting study by economists on strategic extremism and non-strategic extremism a couple of elections ago, where you could map on the more strategic extreme the rhetoric. Often the votes weren't there. So really scrutinizing as Catholic voters, not just what do our values say, but what do voting records say, and how are people using or manipulating rhetoric, values-based or otherwise. And finally, I think the Affordable Care Act gives us two narratives, right? We have the bishop's position on it that several of you have already mentioned, but we also had the not uncontroversial position of CHA, the Catholic Health Association, and many from women religious congregations who said, again, invoking language of conscience, because we've been on the front lines in clinics and in hospitals, and we know what this would mean to expand access. This is a matter of conscience for us. And I think that got cast as disunity or disobedience. But again, I think on this richer notion of a personalist sense of conscience, that's another narrative in that story, such that they came to different conclusions. I was at a talk by Sister Carol Keehan about 2 years ago now, and somebody asked in the audience at the very end, you know, you're a good nun. Why are you up there on Capitol Hill? Why are you making trouble? You know, why aren't you doing, I guess, what this fellow's imagination suggested that she should be more concerned with in terms of direct service and healthcare? And she said, she kind of narrated her decades of experience seeing people not only who lacked insurance having health problems, but also face extreme financial ruin. So she said, if I've been on these front lines for all of these years, and I don't say what I think on Capitol Hill, even if it's with an imperfect bill that doesn't have everything I would like, shame on me. So I do think we have kind of different narratives in the American Catholic story on this recently. Just want to lift that.
Well, I will close our session unless there's any final comments from. I'm going to close with a quote from Jacques Maritain on the common good, a quote that I find to be a helpful, strong description of what the common good entails. This is from his book, The Person and the Common Good, 1966. That which constitutes the common good of political society is not only the collection of public commodities and services, the roads, the ports, the schools, etc., which the organization of a common life presupposes, a sound physical condition of the state and its military power, the body of just laws, good customs, and wise institutions which provide the nation with its structure, the heritage of its great historical remembrances, its symbols and its glories, its living traditions, and its cultural treasures. The common good includes all of these and something much more besides, something more profound, more concrete, and more human. For it includes also, and above all, the whole sum itself of these. The sum is quite different from the simple collection of juxtaposed units. It includes the sum or sociological integration of all the civic conscience, political virtues, and sense of right and liberty, of all the activity, material prosperity, and spiritual riches of an unconsciously operative hereditary wisdom, of moral rectitude, justice, friendship, happiness, virtue, and heroism in the individual lives of its members. For all these things are, in a certain measure, communicable, and they revert to each member, helping him or her perfect his or her liberty and life of person. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very, very much for your provocative, thought-provoking thoughts for the past day. And one last round of applause for our